So first off, let us all welcome Vice Admiral Jose Luis Alano, who was former Undersecretary of the National Coast Watch Council under the Office of the President. He is a skilled sailor and commander, and a former flag officer in command of the Philippine Navy. His meritorious naval career is capped by numerous awards and decorations, including the Distinguished Service Star and a Military Medal Award. Sir, welcome.
Thank you, Pia. Distinguished guests, our esteemed speakers, fellow Filipinos of a maritime nation, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Foundation for National Interest and Amador Research Services, a wonderful maritime archipelagic afternoon. Today, being the first day of Simbang Gabi or Misa de Gallo Masses, we wish you all a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. As we end the year and prepare to welcome 2022, we do so with our year-end webinar as part of our Kwentong Mandaragat series. For those who have been following the webinar series, it's great to have you back, and we highly appreciate your patronage. For those who are here with us virtually for the first time, we value your participation, which reflects your commitment to an open and free discussion towards crafting meaningful national policies. If you recall, we started 2021 with a webinar on how to harness and sustain our marine resources with the topic of the Philippine blue economy, its opportunities and challenges. For this session, we hope to conclude the year with a possible means of securing it. The webinar series aims to provide concrete policy recommendations to address barriers to effective maritime governance in the Philippines. The maritime security environment in the region has always been a concern, but recent developments presents a growing tension, tending towards the likelihood of conflict, brought about by China's increasing assertiveness in the South China Sea and the deepening involvement of the United States and its allies under a backdrop of great power competition. The current maritime security environment has created conditions where the Philippines has to navigate carefully and steadily over thornier sets of policy challenges. The long-standing dispute over the South China Sea is a major flashpoint, threatening Asia and global peace and security. The disputes concern conflicting claims to territory and jurisdiction involving Brunei, China, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. Over the past 5 years, tensions have intensified, giving rise to about armed conflict in crucial waterways, through which close to 1/3 of the global trade passes. Conflict risks have escalated due to the following. The disputants strengthened their efforts to press their claims. China's increasing assertiveness, which includes construction of militarized artificial features in the Spratly Island chain, and with the deepening involvement of the United States and its partners. These are exemplified with incidents such as Chinese survey ship Haiyan DC-8 and its escorts spending several months in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone in 2019. Chinese Coast Guard escorting Chinese fishing boats in Malaysian waters earlier in the year. A PLA Navy electronically locking on a Philippine naval vessel in 2020. The long continued presence of numerous Chinese militias at vicinity of Pag-asa Island and Julian Pilipi Reef, and the recent incident of Chinese Coast Guard ships harassing and water cannoning a Philippine resupply vessel on its way to Ayungin Shoal. These incidents contribute to the unlikelihood of the possibility of a peaceful settlement, more so the probability of arriving with a code of conduct between the claimant states. As the disputes intensify, coupled with rising tensions in the Senkaku Islands and the Taiwan issue with the prospect of forced unification, the risk of armed conflict in the seas is growing. Amid this backdrop, the role of defense has always been to be called upon when nothing positive seems to work and to prepare for the worst case scenario. Defense has always performed its task under the dictum of prepare for the worst and hope for the best. This begs the question, is there a growing arms race? According to Janes, government in the Asia Pacific region allocated more than $505 billion to defense in 2020 and anticipates that the region will overtake North America as the region with the highest defense spending. In 2021, China's defense budget is expected to grow by 6.8%, with emphasis on modernizing the People's Liberation Army, particularly its Navy and Air Force, and turning it into a world-class military, able to fight and win wars against highly developed enemy forces. The PLA Navy has now surpassed the United States in terms of the number of combatant vessels. We also see a surge in its military activities around Taiwan. The risks of a violent conflict are real and rising. Taiwan has been identified as the most conflict-prone issue in the US-China relationship for the foreseeable future. Japan, on the other hand, has requested a budget of $50 billion for 2022, amid Tokyo's view of an increasing intense security environment. The increase represents a 2.9% rise in its annual defense spending, the fastest rate of expansion since 2018. It recently acquired the latest F-35 stealth fighters and is converting its 2 helicopter carriers to aircraft carriers. Down under, Australia entered into a trilateral security partnership with the United States and the United Kingdom to acquire its first nuclear submarines. Teodoro Locsin, the Philippine Foreign Affairs Secretary, welcomed the new security arrangement, claiming it will help maintain peace and stability in Southeast Asia. This was supported by Secretary of National Defense Delphin Lorenzana, who said, Australia, like the Philippines, has the right to improve its submarine defense capability. In Southeast Asia, we also see a noticeable trend of countries modernizing their defense forces, and was the fastest growing military spending region in the world between 2009 and 2018. We saw an increase of 33% over the period. And on the home front, the Philippine defense budget is to rise by almost 8% in 2022, or 222 billion pesos, the largest ever proposed. The maritime security challenges are indeed present, where defense policymakers and planners will have to answer key and critical dynamic questions, such as what strategies will it need to employ to meet the various security challenges? What kind of force structure will be needed to address the situation? And is it feasible for the Philippines to acquire and sustain its desired defense force structure? This brings us to our discussion topic today, and welcome to the Kwentong Mandaragat webinar on the Philippines Submarine Acquisition, Cost, Opportunities, and Learning Curve. As with our previous webinars, we are again fortunate to have assembled an esteemed panel of experts who will unpack for us the various details and issues surrounding a submarine acquisition. This was made possible through the efforts of our organizing team. We are honored to have with us a familiar maritime defense speaker in the region, in the person of Dr. Colin Ko, a research fellow in the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, who will present the topic on naval modernization in the Indo-Pacific. Dr. Marcos Hellier, a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, will tackle Australia's security policy and submarine program. Mr. Stefan Muller, Vice President of Operational Marketing French Naval Group. He will present France's perspective on submarines in Southeast Asia. Our very own Rear Admiral Romel Ong, AFP, retired, a former colleague in the Philippine Navy, and who is currently a professor of praxis at the Ateneo School of Government. We will explore the area of Philippine maritime security needs and naval modernization. And Director Jesse Pascasio, a seasoned defense policy advisor and a trustee of the Foundation of National Interest, who will discuss on the feasibility of a submarine program for the Philippines. Once again, welcome to the Kwentong Mandaragat webinar on the Philippines Submarine Acquisition, Cost, Opportunities, and Learning Curve. Let us all look forward to a vibrant and interactive and worthwhile discussion.
Thank you very much, Admiral Alano, for setting the tone for today's webinar and for providing us the factual backdrop that underscores the individual topics that are up for discussion. Because we have a very limited amount of time for today's webinar, 10 minutes each for the presenters. I will give the floor to them right away. I would just invite everyone to share their questions via the chat box as they come up while the discussions are ongoing, so that the speakers can address them later on during our open forum. So again, without further ado, I invite our first speaker, Dr. Colin Ko, who will be speaking on naval modernization in Southeast Asia. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. A very good afternoon from Singapore, and allow me to thank the Foundation for the National Interest and the Amador Research Services for inviting me to this very important webinar. It makes me recall some years back, I wrote about the Philippine Navy's submarine quest, and pleasantly surprised that it is still an ongoing debate. It hasn't gone away, and it is a very opportune moment to talk about this very important issue. And I'm given the task of giving somewhat, sort of an overview of naval modernization, but certainly more confined to submarine acquisition in the region. And I do not have a specific country to talk about, so I will give a more general view of what submarine proliferation is about, and ultimately, why we acquire submarine capability and what are the issues to look out for. Now, the first is that most people may come to think of submarines as somewhat an enigmatic platform. It is stealthy and it is invisible to the naked eye, right? And probably all you can see is the periscope when it is submerged. And it does, create certain sense of uncertainty in the minds of the beholder, especially when it comes to, peacetime deterrence. When we talk about deterrence, then we are usually referring to two aspects of deterrence. One is the capability, and the other one being the credibility. So these two in combination are usually what constitutes peacetime deterrence, and that's what largely surrounds the use of submarines. And the next question that most people may ask is how big your submarine force ought to be. I'm not here to give a lecture on what exactly you need to acquire, the size of your fleet, but suffice to say is that if you take Southeast Asia as an example, you'll find one very common trend is that most of the fleets in Southeast Asia are decidedly small. You're talking about fleets as small as 2 boats, and for that, Malaysia being one example, and a bigger fleet that we have in Southeast Asia will be in Vietnam, where there are 6 operational kilo-class submarines. And of course, if peacetime deterrence is a crucial factor, and the ultimate goal is in times of crisis, you want to create a certain sense of uncertainty in the minds of the aggressor, then for small navies, submarines tend to be seen as a fleet in being type of capability. So a good example that I show here, this picture isn't just any random picture. I deliberately chose every picture for every slide. This picture is one of a Foxtrot class submarine in the service of the Libyan Navy back in the Cold War. The reason why I use this example is because for the Libyan Navy, it was a very small navy. And even during the time when it was under the rule of Gaddafi, the Libyan Navy boasted a small fleet of Foxtrot-class submarines. And what was interesting is that, throughout the course of history of confrontation between Gaddafi's Libya and the US back in the Cold War, we are referring to the incidents in the Gulf of Sidra, for example. An interesting snippet of this example is that the Foxtrot-class submarines, while a good number of them are always constantly in back then Yugoslavia for its maintenance and overhaul, the US naval attaché in Belgrade were always tasked to keep track of these submarines whenever there is a confrontation between Libya and the US Sixth Fleet in particular. And thereby,
excuse me, Colin, sorry for the interruption. You mentioned that you have your slides, but it's not up on the screen.
Oh, you can't see the slides at all?
No.
Oh, I
There you go.
Screen sharing. Okay.
Yeah, so you may want to recall some of the photos that you were talking about.
Okay, let me see. Okay, is it okay now?
I can see them now.
Okay, great. So yeah, I hope you can see the picture. It's important because all my slides have pictures actually, so it's important to have them. Now, so this story that I want to share is the Libyan Navy back during the time when Gaddafi was in power, and the confrontations between then Gaddafi's Libya and the US, especially in the Gulf of Sidra. And this example amply showed that even for a small navy with a small fleet, it was able to have certain impact on a stronger navy's planning for conflict. So this is, in a way, complicating your aggressor's naval planning in terms of contingency. So therefore, the fact that even if your navy has a small fleet may not necessarily be a handicap. But as what I will caveat subsequently is that even if you have a small fleet, you still need to have the funding and the wherewithal to maintain it in order to be credible. Because if we talk about deterrence, if you could not clearly show how credible you are in terms of using it, then you have to be shown to be credible in maintaining a working fleet in that regard. So you need to be shown to be investing suitably in the upkeeping of this fleet. This is something that I will talk more about at length after. Okay, I hope you still can see the pictures. And of course, during peacetime, we are talking about a range of missions for submarines. And while most people may tend to think that in peacetime, the role of the submarine largely will be for deterrence, but for submarines in peacetime, the likely missions that are undertaken are mainly intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. This is an example of a Canadian submarine that was in this region back in 2018. And this submarine was actually on a very interesting task. And one of its tasks was actually to help to enforce the UN Security Council's sanctions on North Korea. So basically, this submarine is conducting surveillance on shipping that may be carrying out illegal transshipment operations. If you recall, some years back, in fact, around 2010, the Dutch submarine was deployed to the Gulf of Aden to carry out reconnaissance operations that contribute to the counter-piracy operations of the CTF 151. So submarines do have such users, and one will probably tend to question, is it actually suitable to deploy a high-end platform like a submarine to conduct such a mission? And my sense is that any platform is usually useful for a whole range of missions, not least a submarine. While it may appear that using a submarine in peacetime for this sort of ISR operation may not appear to have been the way to go, but this sort of missions do usually provide a good avenue for the crew to upkeep their own proficiency, as well as to gain more exposure operationally. So all these missions tend to present opportunities for training. So it is therefore important not to belittle this sort of exercises in peacetime. It is equally important for any submarine crew to gain proficiency in that sense. Now, so some of the questions that I was tasked to deal with is that while we talk about the missions of the submarines, and what about the potential ramifications of submarine proliferation in the region? So what are the key challenges that one may have to look out for? And the immediate thing that comes to my mind is how potentially a submarine is a platform that could destabilize. By nature of its characteristics, it is stealthy, and thereby, and plus the fact that for submarines, you can't use it for any low intensity operations that concern, for example, maritime law enforcement. And you can't expect a submarine to be going out chasing after pirates, for example. And if anything, if a submarine is required to fight in anger, then it's supposed to kill. The modern submarine today is very unlike a submarine in the past. In the past, back then, during the Second World War, the First World War, you would see submarines equipped with deck guns, and deck guns could be used for lower intensity type of actions, right? But modern submarines are not equipped with these sort of capabilities. They have limited utility when it comes to certain types of constabulary missions. As I mentioned earlier, they could be useful to support certain constabulary missions, such as counter-piracy and even illegal fishing. A good example is back then, a few years back, when the Argentines, when they sent the submarine San Juan to the South Atlantic before it was lost, it was actually conducting, as part of its itinerary of missions, surveilling on illegal fishing operations in the area. So you can conduct all these operations in support of a bigger objective. But if anything, a submarine usually will be regarded as a destabilizing platform. So potential risks, therefore, are something we need to watch out for. A good example here that I show in the picture is the Whiskey on the Rocks incident back in 1981, when a Soviet submarine found itself grounded onto the Swedish coast. And of course, the Soviets argued that the submarine accidentally stumbled into the waters. But considering that the geography of the surrounding maritime environment is so treacherous, you will have actually been quite lucky for any submarine like that to be drifting into Swedish waters without hitting any rocks or any of the small islands in the area. So this sort of incident is something that has been on the minds of the region for quite some time. So far, we have not yet encountered such an incident happening, even though in the more recent times, the threat of it happening could have been higher due to the increased submarine activities in the region. What I'll be thinking about when it comes to clear operational risk is accidents. Accidents that may potentially put questions into the operational status of any submarine fleet. This is the good example of the Japanese maritime self-defense for submarine accident that happened just earlier this year. And this is one submarine out of 16 in total of the MSDF. But for smaller fleets, when you have a submarine that's out of action, then probably you're left with nothing or just left with 1 or 2 submarines. And thereby it could have an impact on your operational status. So accidents like that is something that we cannot discount. It is a potential risk that we have to make do with. And it appears that in the recent times, accidents like that might have become more common. So the more recent example that you might have been very well aware of was the collision of the USS Connecticut in the South China Sea. And of course, the investigation pointed out that it actually bumped into an uncharted seamount. But because the leaders of the boat were being dismissed, it does raise a question whether there is an issue with human error. If you look back into the history of submarine accidents, it will appear that human error has been a very common cause of such incidents. That does lead to what I'm going to talk about later when it comes to what to look out for when it comes to submarine acquisition and programs. But clearly the trend we have here going forward, as we saw in the region and worldwide, is that submarines are coming with better quieting, and they come with better submerged endurance, they come with better combat systems, and they come with better standout weapon capabilities. In sum, we're looking at submarines that are increasingly larger and thereby more capable. One reason is because smaller submarines tend to have smaller room for further upgrades in the future. And because submarines are increasingly expensive to acquire and to operate and to maintain, it is very likely that navies tend to put their submarines in service for longer periods of time. So therefore, larger and thereby allowing subsequent service life extension programs and upgrades of capability. So these are the trends that we see going forward. And I don't see that any different when it comes to the Philippine Navy. But what I'm very, very mindful about is most people tend to focus on submarines, but they forgot that a submarine capability is in effect an ecosystem of capabilities. You're talking about not just the submarines themselves, you're also talking about the supporting infrastructure. And one key supporting infrastructure is submarine emergency response capability, something that many navies in the region, when they acquire submarines, they do not necessarily look into this area. For one reason is because when they acquire submarines, it is already a very costly purchase, and additional purchases in support of it, such as a submarine rescue capability, is an additional cost. And unfortunately, this is one additional cost that I will argue to be very essential. A good example that I want to highlight here is the case of the Indonesians. As you saw earlier this year in April, the Indonesians lost one submarine, and the Indonesians actually did the right things. So unlike what happened back in 2000 for the Russian submarine incident, the Indonesians sought international help almost immediately. The unfortunate thing is by the time help arrived, you have been too late. Even though subsequent investigation indicated that even if help came on time, it would have been too late because the submarine was lost immediately after something happened on the boat. But if you look at Indonesia, a good remedy would not be just to depend on international help, but also to acquire its own organic submarine rescue capability. What I was aware is that the Indonesians for several years have been talking about acquiring a submarine rescue capability, but that has very, very much been left in the back as an afterthought. This incident with the Nanggala actually reignited the debate about whether they should seriously consider a submarine rescue capability, which I believe ought to be something that every submarine operating navy has to acquire. So, if anything, I just want to conclude my brief presentation, which I welcome any subsequent questions and comments thereafter, is to leave us with these incidents. Over here is a collage of key submarine incidents, and they have a common trend here. A common trend here has always been a story about neglect of the fleet. Once you acquire submarines, you neglect the fleet. And by the time you use it, it may be unsafe to do so. That is what happened to the Russian submarine Kursk back in 2000, the Argentine submarine San Juan some years back, and of course for the Indian Navy. So this is something that I believe is a key takeaway for any Navy that is operating submarines or thinking of operating submarines. So final thought is, other than capability, other than capacity, it's important to think about readiness. Readiness in terms of maintenance, repairs, and overhaul, the requisite supporting infrastructure, the personnel training, and proficiency. Last but not least, a submarine business it's very much about sustained funding. So with that, I end my presentation and I apologize for the disruption earlier. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you very much, Colin, for giving us both the historical and analytical view on the utility of and the risks pertaining to the employment of a submarine force. Now, building on these fundamental points, we will be hearing from our speakers, our next speakers, on specific country perspectives relating to the employment of submarine assets within their own fleet, and also as well their utilization in the Southeast Asian region. So first, we will hear from Dr. Marcus Hellyer, a senior analyst for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, to be followed by Mr. Stefan Muller, Vice President for Operational Marketing of the Naval Group. Marcus, you have the floor.
Thank you. And can you hear me? Wave if you can hear me. So, okay, thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I've never had anything to do with you guys before, but it's nice to meet new people, and hopefully you'll get something out of my presentation. Though I guess what I would say is a lot of the key points I wanted to make, Dr. Ko has made already, and the key points really are, it's not about buying a submarine, it's really about operating and sustaining a capability, and there is much more to that than the submarine itself, and there are many, many costs associated with that beyond just the submarine itself. I noted Dr. Ko put up a slide of a Canadian submarine, and I think that the Canadians' history shows how difficult it is to maintain an effective submarine capability with a small fleet. So the Canadians bought 4 submarines secondhand from the United Kingdom. They were pretty good submarines, but the Canadians have had a lot of difficulty maintaining those submarines. And I think it was in 2019, they didn't manage to achieve a single sea day out of their fleet of 4 submarines. So small fleets of submarines are very, very challenging to operate. I'll just note that, so Australia has 6 Collins-class submarines. They're probably the largest conventional submarines in the world. They're close to the Soryu, the Japanese submarines, but so by the standards of conventional submarines, they're very large. That's because we kind of have unique requirements. So we don't see submarines as a kind of defensive asset that operates close to Australia. We want to use our submarines to go a long way from Australia and essentially to operate in the strategic waterways to our north. So whether that be the South China Sea or the Straits of Malacca. So that's a long way from Australia. So to do that with a conventional submarine, you need a large submarine with a lot of range. And so that drives us in a particular direction to essentially a unique requirement. And, some people have argued that any country that wants to do the sorts of things with submarines that Australia wants to do really goes down the nuclear path. And until now, the reason we haven't gone down the nuclear path is we haven't been able to. And so there's been a very significant change in AUKUS that we now have that ability. So, but I will point out that operating that fleet of 6 large conventional submarines, that is the most expensive capability in the Australian Defence Force. We have a lot of expensive capabilities. We have very capable frigates. We have Super Hornets, we have Growler electronic attack aircraft, a whole range of capabilities, but the submarines are the most expensive one. And by my calculation, they probably cost us about 1.2 billion Australian dollars a year. So in US dollars, that's probably around about 800 million US dollars a year to operate a fleet of 6 conventional submarines. So as Dr. Ko said, this is serious expensive business if you want to do it properly. And I'd also note that that does include a submarine escape and rescue capability, which is another very difficult, challenging capability to keep current and effective. So Yeah, our submarine requirements do drive us down in a particular direction, and meeting those requirements with a conventional submarine is difficult. And, I will note that, the submarine that Naval Group was designing and building with us, I think would have been, without doubt, the most effective conventional submarine in the world. In terms of range, in terms of capability, in terms of stealth, in terms of sensor suite, all of those things, it would have been probably the most effective conventional submarine in the world. But the fact is that it still doesn't compare to a nuclear capability, and that is really what forced the government to go down a different path. Now, I've just published a long report published on ASPE on looking at the challenges of implementing our nuclear submarine program, and they are going to be very considerable. But in there, we have a table that compares the range of conventional and nuclear submarines. And it really comes down to this. If you want to operate out of Australia and you want to operate in the South China Sea, even a very capable conventional submarine is probably going to give you 10 to 15 days on station. Okay, it takes so long to get there and so long to get back that you're probably going to have 10 to 15 days on station. A nuclear submarine is probably going to give you 70 to 80 days on station. That's the fundamental difference, is that, one submarine gives you, 5 or 6 times as much time on station if you're talking nuclear submarines. However, the Philippines has very different requirements, so where Australia is probably not a very good analogy for the Philippines. And a better analogy would be probably your neighbors, such as Singapore, Vietnam, and Indonesia. You're much closer to the kinds of areas you want to operate in. And so that means because your requirements are fundamentally different, the solutions are fundamentally different. And so, we can talk about this a bit later. You are sort of in the fortunate position of being able to go to the market. And I think there are existing submarines that will meet your requirements quite nicely. And you don't have to sort of relive some of the difficult journey Australia has had with its kind of unique requirements and unique solutions. So just going through some of the questions that were raised. Look, yeah, I mean, AUKUS is about many things. It's fundamentally a technology sharing arrangement, and it's not just about submarines. It's looking at a whole bunch of emergent technologies, so including cyber, including artificial intelligence, including quantum technology. So it's not just about submarines, but the submarines are the thing that gets the attention. And look, it is going to be very, very challenging for us. It's going to be extremely expensive. So, when we look at the kinds of numbers I was just talking about for our conventional submarine capability, the nuclear submarines are going to be much more expensive than that. So it's going to consume a very large part of our defense budget. And I think any country that wants to get into the submarine business really has to upfront be aware that it will consume a large part of your defense budget. And as Dr. Koh said, it's going to consume that every single year. Okay, you can't neglect your maintenance requirement. You can't neglect your training requirements. For us, moving from conventional submarines to nuclear submarines, that's going to be a huge step up. We don't have much of a nuclear industry in Australia. We don't have any nuclear power. We have one small medical research reactor. So developing all of the infrastructure to support nuclear submarines is going to be very challenging and very expensive. And we're going to need a lot of help from our partners, the US and the UK, in AUKUS, not just to build the submarines, but to develop all of the infrastructure around that. So the physical infrastructure, but also the human capital, to be able to operate submarines safely and responsibly. I think one of the things we're going to have to decide fairly early on is, do we want to build the nuclear submarines here, or do we need to focus our efforts on maintenance and sustainment? So Australia, I think building nuclear submarines here and sustaining them could be more than our industrial base can handle. As I was doing the research for this report, one thing I realized is that, say, one deep maintenance cycle for a US Virginia class submarine is about 3 to 4 times more than a deep maintenance activity on our current Collins class conventional submarines. So just the maintenance on a fleet of nuclear boats, to me, I think would be not just more work than sustaining our Collins boats, but more work than the maintenance on the Collins plus building the attack class here in Australia. So my sense is that we may need to make a decision fairly early on to focus on the maintenance of the submarines in Australia and have them built overseas. But that's one of the things that the newly established Nuclear Submarine Task Force will be looking at. I think politically that will be a little unpopular because I think a lot of Australians will want to build them here for the jobs that are created, but that may actually be more than I think our industrial base can handle. But it does, I think, raise that an issue for the Philippines, and that is, it's one thing to buy a piece of equipment, it's another thing to sustain it, and like we spoke about, what I mentioned about Canadians, you can have submarines, actually using them is a fundamentally different kind of prospect. So one of the questions that was asked here is, is the AUKUS setup a possible model for smaller countries like the Philippines in acquiring a submarine? Well, I don't think AUKUS itself is a good arrangement. One reason for that is simply that the US and the UK don't operate conventional submarines anymore. So they may not be the best partners. I definitely think that the Philippines will need partners to establish a submarine capability, and certainly the US could help in terms of training in how to operate submarines and just sort of thinking about how to use submarines. But probably your best partners for acquiring the submarines and maintaining the submarines would not be the US and the UK. Actually, Australia might have a lot to offer because we actually do have a long history in effectively sustaining conventional submarines that were designed overseas. So our first generation of submarines were the Oberon class that were built in the United Kingdom. Our next generation are our current submarines, the Collins, which were a Swedish design but built in Australia. And for both of those submarines, we had a very long learning curve in understanding how to sustain those submarines. It took us a long time to get where we are now, and now we've sort of reached world's best practice in the sustainment of the Collins. But I would point out what world's best practice actually means is that out of our fleet of 6 submarines, 2 are always in deep maintenance. So 4 are available to be used, but 2 of those will be used in things like training, or they'll be in short-term maintenance. So really only 2 are ever available for operations. And so that's one thing, you need to think about when you're designing your submarine capability, that probably, you have to think about a 1 to 3 kind of model, or even a 1 to 4 kind of model. So for every 3 or 4 submarines you have, you're going to have 1 available for operations. And that's why small fleets are very, very fragile. Okay, Dr. Koh spoke about this. If you have a fleet of 3 and you lose 1, you probably don't actually have the ability to have 1 submarine available for operations at all times. And I think, our colleagues in Indonesia have experienced that. So for a long time they only had 2 submarines, and now they've got a growing their fleet. So there is an issue of critical mass. that 1 or 2 submarines don't give you a real capability. And I think it's Australia's view that probably 6 is about the minimum you need for a critical mass. And some of the analysis we've done that as we move to SSNs, to nuclear submarines, a fleet of 8 or maybe even 10 is kind of the minimum you need to have that critical mass of workforce, of skills, and of the industrial base. I think, when you look at the UK and France, which operate nuclear fleets, they've got a fleet of combined of nuclear submarines of sort of 10 or 11 boats. That seems to be sort of the number you need to maintain a kind of critical mass there. So I think, to go back to an earlier point, the Philippines is actually, your requirements, it seems to me, can be met from the global market. And, there are many companies around the world that would make submarines that would meet your requirements. So whether it's Naval Group in France, or TKMS in Germany, Kockums in Sweden, or the South Koreans now make conventional submarines as well, derived from a German design. There's actually a number of good designs out there which I think could meet your requirements. So they, I think, would be your sort of primary partners, finding a really good commercial partner who can build the submarine for you, and that you can enter into a sort of long-term sustainment kind of arrangement with them. Other countries like the US can offer advice on how to use them. Australia can offer advice on, how to think about sustaining them. But probably, I think a commercial arrangement with somebody like Naval Group or Saab or somebody like that would probably be the best way to go. So I'm just looking at my notes here. Well, I'll just go back to the cost thing again, because money is important, and so a rule of thumb that we have in Australia when we think broadly about capability is that the through life sustainment cost is 3 to 4 times the acquisition cost. So if you buy something for $1 billion, you're going to be spending about $3 to $4 billion over the life of that asset sustaining it. Or if you sort of look at that another way, the annual sustainment cost, the annual operating cost, is probably about 1/10 of the acquisition cost, just as a rough rule of thumb. So, if you buy a submarine fleet for, let's say, $3 billion, the annual operating cost is going to be in the order of at least $300 million, so, that's a big commitment for a defense budget the size of the Philippines. So, what I would say is, if you're going down this path, go into it eyes wide open, because, that you can have any effective submarine capability is going to be expensive. If you want to do it on the cheap, you will not actually have an effective capability. So I think that's the main lesson I would give you from Australia's experience. An effective submarine capability is expensive. So I'll leave it there and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Helger, for sharing those very real considerations that went into Australian undertakings on the submarine front, and also your very specific insights for the Philippines, especially relating to cost. So now we move on from the Australian perspective to the French perspective, in the person of Mr. Stefan Muller, who I should also say, besides his corporate role, was also a former captain of the French Navy. Welcome, Stefan.
Yes, well, I'm happy to be there. I'm very happy to meet you, and I hope I will be able to help you in conducting this good analysis on that very important subject. First, I agree with all that Colin and Marcus said previously, and maybe we will be able to discuss about that a little bit later on. I just want to before entering in detail, I just want to remind you that the underwater world is an opaque to electromagnetic waves, and only sounds are able to propagate very well under waters, better than in the air. And the propagation of sound is, however, complex and requires a good control of its environment. And that's why submarines are a little bit different from other warships, and that give them the operational quality they need to conduct operation just after, and to give credibility and a powerful, and they are also a powerful asset for the navies. They got it, and also it's a good opportunity to improve their overall level of a navy. So if I may, this have no price. If a navy want to get this capacity, it will improve all the navies and all the credibility of the country in terms of defense, deterrence, sovereignty, and so on. So in a sort of way, it's a mandatory passage to improve the defense and the safety of the nation. And we have talked about navies who are in difficulty with maintaining submarines, such as the Canadian Navy. And in the other hand, there is a lot of submarine forces in South America, for example. Chile is able to operate very efficiently 4 submarines without any difficulties and without managing very accurately their budgets. Malaysia is able to operate its 2 submarines with a quite good success. And that's a good story also. So balance is in between. And for the Philippines, there is a story to write with that. So coming back on French issue, maybe on French particularity. So just to maybe remind you something, some figures. France has been building and operating submarine for now more than 120 years. And what is very important is that since the 70s, submarine have been an important axis of development for the French Navy, which has been investing a lot in submarine technologies, and particularly in acoustic warfare. Nowadays, submarines are a pillar of France's autonomy and sovereignty strategy. So France, as Marcus said, France is currently operating 10 nuclear-powered submarines built by Naval Group. The submarine force are composed of about 3,000 people. So it's a big submarine force among the force in the world. Mining is also a concern, a major concern. So the French submarines are deployed throughout the world, all over the world. Naval Group, the French company, is also able to build conventional powered submarines for international navies, notably in South America and also in the Indo-Pacific region. These conventional submarines benefit from the state-of-the-art technology developed for the French submarines, and the conventional submarines developed by Naval Group are extremely stealth and powerful thanks to that state-of-the-art technology. Accurately speaking, they can get an acoustic superiority on many other submarines in the world. What does that mean? As I explained at the beginning, acoustic propagation and sound propagation is the main issue we face on board submarine, with also water tightness, of course, and safety. But operationally speaking, acoustic superiority is the main asset, and these submarines are fitted with the best technology to get that. And they are able to conduct a lot of missions, a large spectrum of missions. Generally speaking, what are the missions France and Naval Group are able to give to their submarines, or to take into account the design of the submarine? So, generally speaking, not accurately in terms of operation mission, the navies who get submarines, who purchase submarine, want to deter by posing a permanent and elusive threat on potential enemies. They want also operate freely and stealthily and also safely in areas controlled by adversary, potentially dangerous for surface vessel and aircraft. That's the main asset of a submarine. Such a vessel can operate in dangerous area which are not accessible to surface vessels. Another type of mission that the submarines can conduct, generally speaking, is to gather and share valuable intelligence without ever being detected. That's a good asset also in peacetime, wartime, and in peacetime. And the last mission I can describe that like that is, if necessary, they can act firmly using powerful weapons or also special means. I won't enter in detail with that. So submarines can counter several type of threats also, such as surface ship, other submarines. They can conduct special operation, anti-piracy operation, and also strikes against land. So there are, in fact, very flexible assets in terms of Navy. And you have to remind also that submarines are virtually invulnerable. So since peacetime, they are used in a very large range of operation, such as anti-smuggling, anti-piracy, anti-traffic, or also the control of sea line of communication, or the protection of navigation routes. So remind also that this operation can be conducted alone or in cooperation with maritimes or joint assets. Talking a little bit about what France and Naval Group is doing right now all over the world, and especially in the Indo-Pacific area. Naval Group is currently involved in several programs, notably in the Indo-Pacific region. In India, for example, 6 Scorpion-class submarines will become the backbone of the conventional submarine force of the Indian Navy. And in Malaysia, France has supported the creation of a submarine force that is now more than 10 years old, and it is working well, in my point of view. They have reached a good operational level now. They sail safely, and they are able to support naval and joint operations. As I said previously, the development of a submarine force contributes directly to strengthening a Navy overall capability. Having submarines manned well with well-trained crews is a good indicator of credibility and determination to ensure security and underwater, on sea and underwater, in front of a powerful adversary. And very frankly, it contributes to the stability by rebalancing forces and allowing the weakness to deter a potentially more powerful adversary. So on France and the support France is able to give to another country, for example. So France, of course, as UK, US, and also a little bit Germany. France masters all technologies in the field of submarines, of course. Our main drivers should be a unique sea-proven experience acquired with the French Navy in contributing to the France sovereignty and deterrence at sea. And this is also available for our international partners. France has also the ability to have a permanent R&D investment to remain at the highest level of technology and to adapt the submarines design to a permanent challenging naval warfare. Naval Group and France are also have also a unique expertise as designer, constructor, and integrator, and long-term support during the whole life cycle. This is important, as Marcus said, because a submarine force has to maintain the submarine, and it's linked to a high level of credibility. So the supply chain and the way the submarine will be maintained are very important. And France and Naval Group have also a proven ability in many countries to adapt to Navy's national specificities and priorities over the whole value chain and the life cycle of that submarines. The idea is to be able to transfer services to get a good, sustainable sovereignty. Training crews from scratch and supporting a Navy in designing its own submarine force, organization, and the support system is also a capability we have in France, and that's a very rare capability. And I don't think there is too much Navy and too much industrial big company which are able to provide this support to navies. In a sort of way, this includes the ability to join specific club of submariners and a specific group and especially safety organization to share safety means and support in case of safety issue. For example, France is sharing its capacity with UK and Norway. And for the Philippines case, of course, a story is readable with other countries in the Indo-Pacific area, especially with Singapore or Malaysia, for example. So you asked me to maybe to conclude with a small focus on what are the technological advancements and for the futures. From a technical point of view, we must have in mind the significant progress made over the last few decades since the 90s, thanks to advance in digitization and improved computing capability and data processing on board submarine, and also investment made in the field of acoustic warfare. So one point is that the submarines designed in the 70s and 80s are now fully obsolete. So as technological advances continue to accelerate, it's important to have stealth silent submarines fitted with more modern combat system, and in particular, high performance sonars. The progress made in automation and digital simulation now allows for easier crew training and simpler and safer operation. That's also very important that right now and in the next few years, this will improve the level of safety and operating submarines. Another point, very, very fast, is weapons. Weapons, especially new heavyweight torpedoes, are fitted with artificial intelligence and powerful batteries And this is also a very interesting axis of development of credibility and efficiency of the submarines. And of course, in the longer term, there is a lot of progress in energy concerning, of course, conventional submarines. So to carry out more complex operations in the future, it will be a little bit more accessible for conventional submarine. So if I may conclude right now with a few points. Navies operating submarines now and conventional submarines will have to maybe face few issues and to ensure their sovereignty by operating modern submarines capable of providing a credible deterrence, deterrent effect during peace and also crisis time, to be also to get also a very offensive potential in case of conflict, to be really credible and deterrent. Be sure also that these submarines will be capable of evolving over times and to adapt to new threats and operational constraints, while also limiting times and cost impact of technical developments and obsolescence threats. So submarines should be innovation ready and evolution ready also. And get sure that submarines acquired are simple to operate and maintain autonomously, and that associated recurring costs will be the lowest as possible, as Marcus said. If you want to reduce costs, think from the beginning about what could be your submarine and what is the design of the submarine and what will be the supply chain and how does it work. In France, the submarine forces, especially the attack submarine forces, because nuclear deterrence is another story, but the attack submarine forces are not the main cost driver of the French defense. And what else? And if you want to save cost and if you want to be able to operate a credible submarine force, of course, you have to create and strengthen a naval industry, a naval ecosystem by acquiring know-how and high performances, high skill, and autonomous industrial capability with a good leverage of investment at the beginning to get an industrial autonomous development and to maintain submarine by yourself or using as possible, as far as possible, the capability you can find in your close in your close industrial environment. So thank you, and I'm ready to listen to the next participant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for sharing with us your perspectives on the benefits of prospective French contribution to the Philippines submarine program. And it's great to have started this webinar with international perspectives. But for now, we are going to have a little break to take a group photo. Our technical staff will be doing that for us. But I would just like to invite all of our speakers who have so far spoken in the program to take a look at the question posted in the chat box by one of your fellow speakers, Rear Admiral Rommel Reyes. And I will get back to that shortly after our photo taking break, because I think it's good to conclude this chapter of the webinar with that question on the participation of the private sector before we move on to our Philippine speakers. So I leave it to the technical staff to count down to the taking of the photo. May I invite everyone to please turn your cameras on.
Hey everyone, I'm seeing 6 panels of bright, beautiful smiles. So the count of 3, smile, 1, 2, 3. Okay, for the second panel, the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. For the fourth panel, 1, 2, 3. For the fourth panel, 1, 2, 3. The fifth panel, 1, 2, 3. And the final panel, 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone. So yes, maybe we can hear from our first three speakers. Maybe they have a quick response to this question about private sector participation in submarine program, submarine asset acquisition. Before we call on our Philippine speakers who are in the position to provide us the practical considerations for the country. Maybe Colin. Sorry, Marcus. Yes.
The first one about whole of nation approach, definitely. So you do need a very strong industrial base to support your submarine capability. Now, I have no doubt if you bought one of Stefan's submarines, that Naval Group would provide you with fantastic support, but it's very important to have a lot of that industrial capability domestically. So we found that when we bought the Oberon submarines from the UK, we had a lot of trouble because we were very dependent on the UK, very dependent on the supply chains from the UK. Similarly, when we built the Collins class submarines, even though we built them in Australia, our initial focus was on building them, not sustaining them. And so we found that after we'd had them for about 10 years, availability just completely crashed, okay, because we didn't have the industrial bases to support them. So we've spent a lot of time building that industrial base, and now we've gotten to the point where about 90% of the components we need to maintain the submarines we can produce here in Australia. So, and that's allowed us to get to what I described as world's best practice in terms of submarine availability, which is still 6 submarines, you only have 2 available for operations. And that's with the benefit of a very sort of good industrial base for it. So again, that's another one of the factors you need to take into account is what is the sustainment model you're going to have? You know, are you going to rely on primarily on an overseas partner, which does expose you to supply chain risks? And what are you going to do domestically, noting that there's another cost involved in developing that domestic industrial base to do that. So, you know, I guess you have a lot of choices, but each of those choices comes with a range of costs and risks. You know, and the more you want to mitigate risk, the more it's going to cost to do that. So.
Thank you. Any thoughts from Stefan or Colin?
Suppliers at
Maybe just ask our other participants to mute themselves. Okay, thank you.
Hi. Thanks. I fully echo what Dr. Harry has mentioned. I wanted to bring in another dimension about the importance of having private sector, be incorporated in this whole government approach or whole nation approach. Is that I think very often one may think of acquiring submarines as purely just a defense business, but it could also have an economic business in a sense. That when you acquire submarine, the associated offsets, for example, that could potentially contribute to the wider industry, creating jobs and creating an ecosystem of supporting companies that could generate employment, generate other sort of economic spin-off is important. I think that is one aspect to consider, especially these days when the domestic constituents get increasingly concerned about how the government spends money, especially on defense, and they wanted to see clear economic benefits of a defense build-up. So for an expensive program like submarines, I think, you know, generating this sort of public support through the promise of some sort of a spin-off from submarine program may be very important in this light. Thank you.
And if I may, I'm showing everything which has been said, and something more. Philippines are very in the middle of the ocean, so it's a country which is facing navy or maritime naval issues every day, and submarines is a good point to enter a little bit more into the under the water, because a lot of things is happening under the water. Hydrography, oceanography issues, environmental issues also, and not only in terms of defense. And it will open eyes on a lot of people on what is happening underwater, and technology could be also developed around that big ecosystem around submarines.
Thank you very much for those initial thoughts, and for Stefan for underscoring that for the Philippines, which is an archipelagic nation, it's such an important issue that we often tend to forget that, you know, the navigational regimes under the international law or the law of the sea actually makes us very vulnerable to the activities of these submarine assets. So I know that our next few speakers have specific slides also addressing this question of what are the economic benefits, how can the private sector participate in these public initiatives. So I will get on and introduce the next two speakers now. First, to talk to us about Philippine maritime security needs and naval modernization, we have Rear Admiral Romel Jude Ong, who is currently Professor of Praxis at the Ateneo School of Government and former Vice Commander of the Philippine Navy. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Can you hear me, Pia?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In the interest of time, I will go direct to the point. Let me lay first, from lawyer speak, let me lay first the predicate with respect to the Navy submarine program. The first concern that we have is we have to address the fact that China's maritime axis of advance affects us in two ways. The first one is the axis of advance, the Oceania-South Pacific advance, which is directed to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And the second one is the Indian Ocean, Africa-Europe axis of advance, which passes through the South China Sea. Now, this slide depicts what we call the A2AD environment, the anti-access area denial construct of China's strategy. The point being, from a perspective of these types of weapon systems, South China Sea and the entire Philippine archipelago is already affected. This is an interesting slide based on the study conducted by the U.S. Congressional Research Service. It's about the comparison of the battle force between China and the United States. Battle force is composed of the submarines, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and corvettes. And in terms of from a temporal perspective, if you look at the movement or of the shipbuilding capabilities of China with respect to the United States, China has already surpassed in terms of production of the battle force the U.S. Navy since last year, 2020. And I just read a Twitter post this afternoon that China is looking at producing Type 55 destroyers, at least 20 per year in the succeeding years to come. So the surface fleet threat from the Chinese, the PLA Navy is real. Now, if you look at the air domain, we're looking at least the potential threat of the aerodromes that exist now in the Kilayan Island Group, as well as in Hainan. So in theory, if you post, let's say, a J-11 strike aircraft in any of those airfields, they have the ability to already dominate the airspace of the South China Sea, as well as parts of the Philippine archipelago. Now, what I am driving at here is that the South China Sea is no longer a permissive environment for surface forces. Okay? Because of the preponderance of the surface force of the PLA Navy, the A2AD construct of its strategy, as well as its potential ability to project air power over the South China Sea. We are facing a very challenging environment for surface forces. Okay. Now, in this slide, we look at now the what the Philippines need to defend. Aside from our maritime interest in the West Philippine Sea, we have to defend the Philippine archipelago. And from here, I think if you look at you conduct a cursory center of gravity analysis, the decisive point of any conflict from a maritime environment would be any of the 7 strategic sea lanes we have, or archipelagic sea lanes. But more importantly, the 3 ones facing the West Philippine Sea, meaning Luzon Strait, Mindoro Strait, and Balabac Strait. Now, sometime in 2014, Secretary Gasmin, who was the SNB then, issued his capability decision memoranda, which it directs the AFP and the major services to address the capability gaps that were identified during the last serious DCAPS process that was conducted in the past years, and that was in 2014. Now, based on that capability gap, all the services proposed or submitted the respective capability proposals. Okay, sorry, dito pala. Capability proposals. Now, out of those capability proposals or force packages, we developed the Naval Capability Plan. Now, I tweak it a bit so that I will not violate non-disclosure protocols, but essentially, the Navy proposed 5 capability packages to address the requirements of the Department of National Defense to plug the gaps that were identified during the DCAPS process. Now, the submarine program is part of the asymmetric deterrence capability package that the Navy proposed. And it is part in synergy with the proposal also to acquire a land-based missile system, or the SBMS and the SBATS program. So it is supposed to work in synergy. The submarine program is not designed to work in isolation of other capabilities. Okay. Now, going back to the previous slide, I'm going to use a simple SWOT matrix to look at how the Navy decided then at that time in 2016. SWOT matrix is based on our internal assessment of our strength, our weakness, and looking at the external environment in terms of opportunities and threat. Now, we work on the expand strategy, but if you ask me, don't you think that is not sustainable, because the Philippines as a country and the armed forces as a military organization has inherent weaknesses that it needs to address so that it will not fit within an expand strategy or a strength opportunity matrix. I will agree with you, but mind you that we have to the decision process was the Philippines defending the archipelago on its own. Okay. And it has the dissonance of that decision is that it has to do a unilateral buildup. It has to be a Navy-only capability. And it's, of course, resource challenge option, and it has to address intra-service competition in terms of resources. Now, the ideal solution would have been to work at it at different matrix. Like example, if you look at it from a consolidated strategy, for this to work, we need to improve our relationship with the Philippine Coast Guard and share the burden of defense and security of the archipelago. But that is still in the nascent stage. I think it hasn't really taken off even up to now. On the niche strategy, we need to work with a better alliance management. And we all know in the past 6 years, that has been problematic. Okay. Now, a niche strategy would allow us to have develop specific capabilities in support of an alliance system. Okay, the best example would be yung NATO navies at the height of the Cold War between NATO and the Soviet Union. The NATO navies then developed only niche capabilities for mine warfare and anti-submarine warfare, and allow the United States and the United Kingdom to develop the higher level of capabilities. So that is a niching strategy. We don't have that. The last one would have been a merge strategy, or this is a strategy of last option. We defend not only the Philippine archipelago, but also the entire South China Sea ecosystem in conjunction with other ASEAN allies or ASEAN partners. But of course, that is something that is not feasible at this point in time. So we are left with a disconnected strategy, which is an expand strategy that we have to work with despite our limited resources. Now, this is the decision tree, as I recall, when we approached the submarine program. There was a decision to acquire the submarine capability because of the impinging security challenges in the South China Sea that a surface force will have to confront with. And the fact that we still need to work with our alliance and partnerships from the level of in terms of interoperability. Okay, so we embark on an expand approach or an expand strategy, and we look at manned systems. Okay, manned systems that have the capability for anti-submarine and anti-surface as well as ISR capabilities. Okay. Now, if I recall, when I was still a chairman of the modernization board, I tucked in 2 billion in the second list of the second horizon. I don't know if it's still there, but that was supposed to invest in R&D in terms of unmanned systems. That is a complementary effort to the manned system to develop an unmanned ISR capability. Now, taking all those things into consideration, where is the Philippines now situated? For one, South China Sea, as I said earlier, is no longer a permissive environment for a surface fleet. The basic issue is survivability. Second, we are obliged to defend our archipelago, particularly the decisive points, which are the archipelagic straits. We are working with a legacy fleet. Most of them are old, World War II, although I think based on the Navy right now is decommissioning most of them already. We are forced to develop a unilateral capability build-up posture, okay, because we have alliance management issues. Then because of that, that is where we are situated right now. Now, this is my last slide on recommendations. And this is taking into consideration the inputs of the previous speakers, particularly Colin, and the presentation of Jesse later on, which is more on the economic aspects. We need to assess the impact of the submarine acquisition to the current force structure of the Navy, its spending plan, and the profile of the future surface fleet. Okay. My recommendation would be to wargame already the POM, or the Program Objective Memoranda, X years from now when we do have that submarine program in play, and look at how it will impact on a constrained fiscal space. Okay. On a projected constrained fiscal space. As I said, this will now force us to look at the program realistically and look at the opportunity cost of the submarine program in terms of the other programs that we may need to give up or we may need to scale down. Second point is we need to collaborate with the Coast Guard on the division of roles and its impact on the profile of our future surface fleet. Example, who will own the OPV role? When I was asked in previous lectures about comparing the Coast Guard with the Navy, my analogy would be the Coast Guard is like your local policeman in the community or the barangay. He's always moving around the community, talking to the residents, and whenever there is a crime, he arrests the perpetrator and put him to jail. Your Navy is your local fire department. Your local fireman normally just stays in barracks, waiting for that bell in case there's fire. And that's the only time that it goes out. Okay. So it goes back to the question of who owns the OPV role, because the OPV role means you have to be at sea all the time for maritime security role or maritime security missions. Navy would have to work it out later if it still wants to assume that maritime security role or give it to the Coast Guard with the constraint imposed, which is resources. Okay. Can you still afford to play that role? If yes, all the better. But if not, then that is where the opportunity costs come into play. Third is you have to understand your battle space and how to dominate it. As I said earlier, the decisive point would likely be the archipelagic straits, any of the 7 archipelagic straits that the Philippine archipelago possesses. Okay? And that means you have to invest in marine research and surveillance as well as other capabilities within the submarine ecosystem. Next is you have to leverage alliance and partnership to help reshape the future fleet. For example, Colin, I think, brought up the issue of a submarine rescue vessel. I think that is an important factor. It would be criminal to develop a submarine capability without a parallel submarine rescue capability in play. Both should be factored into the program. But just in case there is a cost issue there, we may need to look at developing a submarine rescue program in partnership with other allies or partners in the region, so that there would be a shared burden of such capability. Okay. Other partnerships, the private sector was mentioned. The submarine program needs to grow with a robust defense industry, as well as a robust academic backpacking. As we develop the submarine capability, we need to look also at the entire ecosystem of industries that will be supporting it, upstream, downstream, and lateral. On the academic side, we need to invest in STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, because where else will you source the future submariners, and where else will you source the future technicians that will support the maintenance of the submarine program? It cannot be grown overnight like mushrooms. So you need to invest not only in the hardware, but in the humanware. And the humanware is not only within the Navy, but also outside of the Navy, which supports the ecosystem of the submarine program. The last one is we need to study AI, robotics, and quantum computing. We need to be ahead of the learning curve rather than at the back end of it. Technology is moving very fast. We do not want to be caught with our pants down trying to develop a capability that suddenly becomes obsolete by the time we are ready to acquire it. So as a safety measure, we need to be ahead of the learning curve in terms of the other technologies emerging and currently in play. So that when we need to fine tune the program in the future, we will not be caught unawares. I think that is the end of my presentation. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Admiral Ong, for giving us some very pragmatic considerations for this initiative of building a really modern submarine program for the Philippines. Now, to build on your presentation, we have for our final presenter, Mr. Jesse Pascasio, who was formerly Director for Strategic Planning and Communications of the National Coast Watch Council Secretariat of the Philippines, and also an expert who has served in various Philippine departments and Philippine offices, notably the Department of Defense, and who can talk to us about the feasibility of a submarine program for the Philippines.
Thank you very
Sir
much.
Jesse?
Thank you very much, Pia. And I wish to thank my fellow speakers for sharing their thoughts on this very important issue of national significance. I would be briefly discussing mainly the potential impact of this proposed acquisition to the national economy. I will proceed with my discussions utilizing basic economic models, and due to the limited time, I would not bore you with so much numerical figures in this analysis. Rather, I would be discussing if and how the Philippines can afford this expensive program. Next slide, please. Okay, the relationship between defense spending and national economics has been discussed as early as the classical period of economic thought. The basic premise of classical thinkers is that economies are self-regulating systems governed by natural laws of production and exchange, most famously explained by Adam Smith's invisible hand. According to him, the first duty of sovereigns is to protect society from violence and invasion of other states through a military force. The type of forces a nation is able to finance is based largely on the level of manufacturing achieved by that country. He likewise considered that military labor is unproductive and produces value only for itself. This means that military is sustained by the labor of others, and it doesn't produce any good that can be traded in the market upon which additional value can be produced. Next step. His views was supported by other economic thinkers, including Jean-Baptiste Say, who posited that demand for security allows the government to collect taxes to defend the state. Since it is the demand for security that gives the population reasons to be taxed, it necessarily follows that the size and shape of the military will not go beyond what is barely sufficient to repel an external armed attack. For JBS, nations in the long term will rely on the strength of the internal polity and international cooperation and trade in order to preserve peace and security. While much has since changed from the classical period to the postmodern societies we are now in, their basic premises on what constitute responsible, and I think I would have to emphasize that word, responsible defense spending still resonates to this day. As societies and technologies develop, so does the cost of building and maintaining a standing military force. In many countries, defense spending is unproductive in spending, as it only gives value to military organizations. Unless a country has a significant defense industry that contributes to the national economy in terms of jobs, taxes, and exports, defense expenditures are merely sunk costs, the value of which is difficult to ascertain. This is why even modern political thinkers such as Samuel Huntington counsels for military services to craft a strategic concept that will justify the burdens that they exact from society. Thus, given the rising and long-term cost of defense acquisition such as submarines, we need to make decisions from a whole-of-life perspective. The acquisition cost is only the cost of that most often is presented to the public, as mentioned by the other speakers already. But we know that this is only a small part of the burden that we want the taxpayers to support. Defense procurement planners must be able to show the whole of life requirements of submarines, which could easily double or triple or quadruple the cost of acquisition. As the subsequent presentations will show, there is no other way to present the proposed submarine acquisition other than a gargantuan public expense or public burden. It is a question of whether a Philippine polity can and may be willing to carry this burden. Now, the basic economic model used to measure economic equilibrium is the C plus I plus G times plus X minus M. From this basic model, the optimizing goal for submarine acquisition is to be at least neutral, a break-even, so to speak, since it will be an unproductive expense. This simply means that the government expenditure must be paid somehow, either by an increase in government revenues, private investment, or trade transfers. Let us now look at the impact of the submarine acquisition on these different economic factors. First, we need to look at measures we may use to account for the factors that is unique to the submarine acquisition. Consumption will be measured based on employment generation, private investment through industry development, government through tax and non-tax revenues, and trade balance in terms of offsets such as counter trade. Now, on consumption, the in-country production and maintenance of submarines will create a small number of jobs. In the case of Australia, the replacement of the Collins-class submarines is expected to generate just 2,800 jobs over the life of the vessels, and we are talking of 12 vessels. The Philippines is looking at just a handful. Likewise, the planned Philippine acquisition will be an importation, so no jobs will be created by the directly by the expenditure. Now, on private investments, there is currently no local or international shipbuilder in the Philippines that produces submarines for export. Okay, prior to the pandemic, the Philippines is number 3 in the terms of shipbuilding, but 98% of that output is produced by only 2 shipyards, Hanjin and Tsuneshi. Hanjin has since closed down. Tsuneshi is not building submarines. Therefore, the big bulk of the output of shipbuilding in the Philippines cannot actually support in-country production of submarines. Countries that are producing submarines have specialized shipbuilding facilities dedicated for submarines. Australia built a shipyard virtually from scratch just to make Collins-class submarines. It will not make any economic sense for a current shipyard to repurpose a large area of its operations to be dedicated for Philippine submarines. Thus, the submarine acquisition may not is for private investments at all. Now, with consumption and private investments held in constant in this case, we are left with tax and non-tax revenues and trade offsets as a means to make acquisition affordable. Okay, specific laws such as RA 7898, as amended by RA 10349, otherwise known as the AFP Modernization Act, provided for a special funding means for defense acquisition. The law provided a funding of 75 billion over the first 5 years. As this will be coming from governmental appropriations, much of this is already tax revenue. The program was allotted 68 billion under the National Expenditure Program for 2021 to 2022. Assuming an operational readiness of say 70%, the Philippines would need a minimum of 3 submarines, 2 up and 1 down. And this is actually a very, it's not actually a conservative estimate based on the presentation of the first speaker. There are those who say that we only need 1. I find this to be a total lie bordering on a betrayal of public trust. There is no value to have just 1 because we will end up with either 100 or 0 capability at any given time. There is no point to buying just 1 unit. If we compare the acquisition and operating cost of submarines, we can see that government appropriations alone will not be sufficient to acquire and operate these assets. The operating cost alone may already consume the whole PN budget, and this doesn't in fact include the whole the other whole of life cost. Now, present laws also provide for other funding mechanisms. However, almost a decade since the law was passed, there is yet any of these lease or joint development or public-private partnerships that was entered into by the DND and AFP that is of such scale and magnitude to reduce the reliance to tax revenues to finance AFP modernization. The AFP Modernization Trust Fund stands at a paltry 4.1 billion as of 2021. Likewise, as the major funding schemes relies on real estate disposition of military assets, it should be noted that many of the prime AFP real estate is mired in litigation, such as the lots in Fort Bonifacio. Thus, it is still unclear how much more revenue can be generated through these means. This is not to say that there are no other means to finance modernization in a large scale. Future potential sources of revenue includes government shares in oil exploration and offshore mining. But alas, we cannot do that in the rich area of the West Philippine Sea. The AFP can also benefit with the sale and development of prime government real estate, such as the NAIA complex and Manila Port area, but it will take a lot of political will to come up with the necessary policy direction of consolidating aviation to either Clark or the future airport in Bulacan, and transferring international shipping to Batangas and Subic in order to free this real estate for development. And the current pension law that is being discussed in the House proposes already that income from the NAIA complex will be used to finance future modernization and pension increases. Now, likewise, the National Economic Development Authority estimates that the country may benefit from the country's blue economy if its main barrier to development is unlocked through the Maritime Zones Act. However, Congress and the executive has procrastinated on this task since 2010. If Congress and the executive can cooperate on unlocking these potential revenue-generating policies, the submarine acquisition program may just have the resources it needs to succeed. Finally, let's deal with trade offsets, as the acquisition is expected to be an importation. Trade offset has been a growing practice in order to defray either parts or full of the purchase cost. There are generally two ways to do an offset. Direct offset, wherein production of some of the components are done by the buyer country, and indirect, where there is a provision for technology transfer, local investment, and counter trade. Now, offsets, though, are controversial. U.S. Congress has tried to discourage industrial offsets to protect research and development investments. On the other hand, European countries view offsets as an outright offset ban as protectionist on the part of seller countries and a challenge to free trade. Regardless, though, of how other countries view trade offsets, the Philippines has a specific rule governing this matter under Executive Order 120 series of 1993. Present regulations present two modes of counter trade, which is applicable for submarine acquisition. The first is counter purchase, wherein the foreign supplier reciprocally commits to buy goods and services that may be sold in the seller's country. This is a means to open an exports market in the seller country. The other means is an offset, where the foreign supplier commits to introduce investment in the Philippines. The goal is for technology transfer. However, again, our experience with counter trade remains dismal. Next slide, please. The products that we have traded are mainly small-scale businesses, such as in garments and desiccated coconut. On the other hand, offsets have mainly been on travel services and integrated logistic support component that hardly transferred any technology to the Philippines. And I have 5 slides. Yeah, I have 5 slides there that actually shows the various counter trade transactions of the Department of National Defense from 1994 up to 2014. Okay, and it shows that we were only able to recoup $200 million of worth of sale, and we are not actually sure whether the the exporters were able to come up with a footprint in the country where we actually had the counter trade. Okay, so we had a very, very bad experience, or pathetic experience with respect to counter trade, and that is not good in terms of us trying to do a counter trade for a large acquisition such as a submarine. Now, in summary, submarine acquisition in the Philippines will be affordable if it is done in a manner that doesn't dampen consumption and private investments. Ergo, no tax increase. So if we are going to argue, for example, that we are going to increase VAT, no, from 12 to 15% in order for us to come up with a submarine program that will dampen consumption, because that is going to make prices of goods increase, and that will also dampen private investments. Because of all those negatives in the equation, it is going to invite recession, and we don't like that. Okay. Likewise, appropriation should not be the sole source for acquisition and maintenance, since relying on annual appropriations may entail in special taxation. We need to generate revenues in industries with long-term payouts, such as offshore oil exploration and development of the blue economy. And that is why Reed Bank is very important for us. We get that, we produce oil from that, then we could start these kinds of big ticket acquisitions. And mind you, the countries, with the exception of Singapore, the countries in Southeast Asia which has submarines actually also have sizable offshore oil explorations. Okay. Finally, we need to have a model for long-term industrial offset that can generate real revenues for government. The Philippines do not have this policy and economic means as of now. We are not actually looking at paying the submarine acquisition entirely, 100%. Well, part of that will always be paid by taxes, but we need to have a model in which it will not burden the middle class, which is actually the taxing portion of our population. So we need to really generate a lot of investment, a lot of of revenues in order to afford it right now. Now, in conclusion, the current political economic consideration make submarine acquisition irresponsible, and to actually use the word of Admiral Ong, it will be criminal to do it right now, and is strategically counterproductive. Without a definitive policy, revenue, and expenditure framework that taxpayers can support, any investment in submarine acquisition now is bound to fail, with no means for government to recoup the losses. It may weaken our economic fundamentals necessary to support a still developing and modernizing military. There is no point to acquiring and maintaining a capability that will make us poor in the end. Hence, we need to bring this matter back to Congress. We need a dedicated legislation that provides automatic appropriations based on a defined revenue source for the program in order to make this a viable, though unproductive, national endeavor. Alternatives are also present, and this will rely on our country's diplomatic ability to enter into complex security arrangements. One way is to internationalize our maritime defense concept. We need to once and for all depart and discard this notion that nations can defend themselves alone. It never happened. Successful defense has from ancient times been based on alliances and partnerships among sovereigns and states. To stand alone is to invite aggression. Independent foreign policy must be based on the pursuit of national interest, not on some grand propaganda of standing on our own. By accepting international partnerships as components of national defense, we can develop the necessary facilities and arrangements to ensure that rotational presence of powerful submarines from our ally and our partners are in the Philippines in exchange for gradually developing our own niche capability on anti-subsurface capability. We need to be more creative in developing our defense concept, since it is not the superiority of arms that makes and wins wars, but the soundness of strategies supported by the nation's public. And I think that is my contribution to this discussion, and I do hope I was able to elucidate some of the issues posed by the questions on the chat box.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much, Sir Jesse, for your very practical analysis of all the questions that we've been asking since the start of this webinar. Can we do it, and when do we do it? Can we do it now or not? we are out of time actually, and I apologize to all the participants in the room. But if I may I just request that we extend for a further 10 minutes to move on with our open forum and address some of the questions that are already in the chat box. And I see that there is already a discussion going on, and it's good that we can jump off of Sir Jesse's presentation, because two of the questions from Ambassador Asuke and Attorney Neil Silva, they relate to the acquisition of potentially other kinds of submarine related assets without the actual acquisition of submarines, that the Philippines may be better off looking at investing on in the meantime, in the immediate term. So I want to ask the other speakers for their perspectives on these two questions specifically.
Pia,
Anyone who wants to share? Okay, yes, sir.
bago lang i-qualify ko lang yung word na criminal ni Jessie kanina. That's not referring to the submarine program, but a parallel submarine rescue program should be in play along with the submarine program. Okay.
Thank you.
Not the entire program. Okay, yun lang. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And on the questions, maybe I could repeat them for the audience. The first question was, would anti-submarine warfare technology and expertise be a viable option, including underwater microphones or sonars? Is this a viable approach? And the other question is, what other technologies would be more important and should be prioritized by the Philippines for its actual circumstances? Yes, Stefan.
One point is, which is very important, is in terms of underwater and anti-submarine warfare. If you are not knowing what submarine are doing and how they are operating, you won't be good anti-submarine warfare operators. So there is no way, if you want to understand what is happening underwater and what are the strategic movement and displacement and operation nations are conducting into your economic water and into your territorial water, you should get submarines. Otherwise, you won't never know what is happening there, and you won't never know how to fight it without getting into the submarine depth technology. In fact, that's my point of view.
Thank you, Dr. Ko or Dr. Hellier.
Yeah, may I? Okay. Well, it sort of made me recall the approach that Singapore took, because Singapore, at the very initial stages, wanted to build what we call a three-dimensional capability, but back then it had no money to acquire submarines. So what happened was we went on to acquire ASW capability. So we had our corvettes being equipped with torpedoes, but we made use of our existing partnerships with submarine operating regional navies to train on ASW. So a good partner with us was actually India and also Australia and the US. So that could be an interim solution. But ultimately, for any navy to create an underwater concept of operation and a more robust ASW concept, then it might actually be a good idea to have its own submarines in that light, because not all the time you get the opportunity to train with other Navy submarines. So in order to do so, then you may need to have your submarines. But until then, until funding allows, then cooperation with other navies would be a more cost-effective way forward. Yeah.
Pia?
Yes, sir. Go ahead, please.
Qualify ko lang yung ASW capability is directed towards, of course, countering yung adversary submarines, okay? But that's not the point of the capability approach ng Navy at the time. It was to provide a solution to the Chinese surface fleet. not the Chinese submarine. Kumbaga, we're not going into the varsity. We're not going to play in the varsities. We're going to just work on providing a deterrence and a tactical solution to the problem of the preponderance of surface forces by the PLA Navy. Okay, and we're not and I do not personally, I do not envision us operating in the South China Sea. Why? Because I expect that the US, the UK, and the Australian submarines will be lurking, and we will be providing a confusing presence there by operating in the South China Sea. I think we should best operate within what I stated earlier as our decisive points, the choke points, and focus on making sure that they do not ingress, egress our archipelago, as well as we have that latent capability to threaten their maritime commerce if it comes to a shooting war. Okay, so it should nuance. The program should be nuanced, and it has to address specific objectives, strategic, tactical, and operational objectives. It's not, and it is going to have to be contextualized into operating with the alliance and other partners as well. So if you envision an airspace management system in the air when allied air forces work together, you have to also envision a submarine management, space management mechanism somehow wherein allied and partner submarines will have their own sweet spot to operate in and not interfere with each other's backyard, so to speak. So I hope that explains it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Yes, I think we should be able to cover those basics first before any grander ideas, any grander notions of what this submarine program could be for us. Dr. Hellyer, did you want to add something? You were also explaining on the chat box your responses. You are currently muted.
Yeah. So the issue of what is the conservative service level of operational readiness that the Philippines Navy should consider in the submarine acquisition. I mean, look, different operating models will, produce different numbers there. I think, probably a better analogy would be your colleagues in Singapore or Indonesia or Vietnam, because they're sort of operating small conventional submarines close to home. One of the challenges for us is that we are operating submarines over long distances, a long way from home. That said, there seems to be a sort of fairly universal kind of almost a law that which is a 3-for-1 or even 4-for-1 kind of model. We find that whether we're operating submarines or ships or fighter planes or infantry battalions, you can sustain one on operations for every 3 you have. So, if you want to, operate an infantry battalion on operations, you need 3 of them to sustain that. And I don't think that's just Australia. My understanding of the United States Navy with their SSN force is that they basically have roughly a 4-for-1 kind of model, that for every boat you want to have off on operations, you need a total force of 4. And you look at, the French SSBN force or the UK SSBN force, that if you want to maintain one deterrent boat at sea, you need a force of 4 to support that. So there seems to be a sort of fairly universal law here. Now, that doesn't mean at times you can't surge beyond that. So for a short period, if you had a force of 4, then maybe you could get 2 to 3 to sea for a short period. But we find that out of our 6, 2 of them are almost always going to be out of the water, undergoing deep maintenance. So you're not going to be able to surge them and get them to sea. So perhaps, Colin could sort of talk about the Singaporean experience, but I think if you want to guarantee one boat, then you're going to need at least 3 or maybe 4 in total force.
If I could quickly jump in after building on what Dr. Harrier has mentioned, the one perennial issue that the Singapore Navy faces, notwithstanding the fact that these days we do actually enjoy quite substantial funding for the Navy, the issue has always been not so much the boats per se, but the manpower. We are facing a manpower issue. And to be honest, submarine business is not just about the issue of maintaining the boats, but also to get a willing pool of people who can serve on board. And it comes with the training, it comes with the necessary remuneration, and it takes a special kind of people to be submariners, because basically you have to lead a very different lifestyle within the steel cylinder, and you have to make do with the privations and the other problems on board submarines. So for the Singapore Navy, it is not so much the asset that's an issue, but it's more of the crewing that is a big problem. And of course, there's always a competition between the Navy for talented personnel and with the other commercial industry. And this is something that Singapore has been facing for a while. So I do see this issue not confined to Singapore as a small Navy, but also larger navies around the region, including those in Japan. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Director Pascasio?
Yes. And I think I would just echo a point that was made by Colin Ko. We cannot pursue this program under our current policy framework. It will be totally irresponsible to do so. Number one, as mentioned by Colin, you cannot manage the human resource necessary to operate a successful submarine force in the same manner that you are managing surface warfare officers. They have to be given a different set of promotional system, maybe remuneration, allowances, etc. Okay, we don't have that right now. Our rules provide for the same treatment across all types of forces. No? So again, we have to look at this from a long-term perspective. Okay, so if we are going to develop this from a long-term, and we are going to acquire the submarines maybe 10, 20 years down the road, because we need to put up the necessary infrastructure in order to ensure that we have a running submarine, not a submarine that we could display at port, no, for high school students to see. We don't like to end up with that. Okay, so if we want to do it that way, my question here is one of strategy. By that time, the main adversary has already upgraded its capability again. Now we're playing catch up. Okay, and in a situation when we are actually playing catch up, okay, what is now what is now the assurance that this is still the necessary capability that we should have 10, 20 years down the road? So we should be thinking far long term, rather than on the 6-year horizons of the AFP modernization program. I think that is the best way in which we are going to make such a gargantuan public expenditure. If we simply continue to argue that we buy submarine right now, it could be used for search and rescue, it could be used for counter piracy, it could be used for other low level threats. My answer in that is the cost-benefit economics doesn't support acquisition, because you have far cheaper options to do that rather than buying submarines. Okay, and it's gonna be unfair for Filipino taxpayers to be using that amount of resources, to develop this one capability. We are not even sure that it's gonna deter our main competitor right now. Other countries in Southeast Asia has already bought submarines. Indonesia has, I think, 5 Vietnam has 6, Indonesia has 5, Malaysia has 2. It never deterred the main competitor. how sure are we that acquiring these submarines will provide the deterrent that Admiral Ong has actually mentioned? Most probably, it will not.
Okay, thank you very much, Sir Jesse. I think that's a good point to end on, considering also the diverse range of participants that we have in the audience today, who are very much involved in current discussions on this subject. I think we have a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Yes, po. Okay, go ahead.
Alam
Sir.
ko lang, I think we should give credit to the Navy that they've done their homework. The issues that Jesse has raised were actually discussed years ago, and they were part of the inputs in developing the program. I agree that in terms of cost, it is an expensive proposition, but it's something that requires refinement. Okay? Saying that the program is invalid, I think is a lose-lose proposition. Let's work on the program. Let's look at how to improve it. In any case, the program has been shifted to the third horizon already. So we have enough time to incorporate all of Jesse's concerns and make appropriate revisions. Okay. If you note, the bullet that I mentioned was we need to keep ahead of the technology. We are also looking at the possibility by the time the submarine is acquired, the technology is obsolete. Okay, so that means it's part of doing the homework is making sure that we question ourselves on a periodic basis whether we should pursue this or not, because the technology is no longer relevant to the threat. Okay. So doing the homework before and doing the homework way forward is necessary to make appropriate changes in the program. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Indeed, as I said, we have a lot to think about. No, we have the pros and cons laid out for us by our speakers today, and even though it might be something that could entail a huge cost to the national organization, the national well-being of the Philippines, it is nevertheless a necessary improvement that we do need for all our defense concerns. So it will become a more relevant discussion for the upcoming elections, which has implications for the next 10 to 20 years that will be confronted by this issue. We have been given a lot to think about for our last webinar for the year by our speakers. So I hope that everyone who's still with us now in the meeting room could share with us their reactions by answering an evaluation survey that we have put on the chat box. We look forward to your ideas on better topics for conversation for the coming year. We hope to see you all again. Thank you very much to our speakers for the very extensive discussion, very valuable points for today. And goodbye to everyone. Don't forget to fill out that evaluation form, and happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy Christmas. Happy holiday.
Thank
Bye.
you for all the speakers.